Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm particularly grateful to those of you who come to my lectures fairly often. It's inspiring. So tonight, I'm going to talk about shamanism. And whenever you hear the word ism, you associate it with a system of belief, often with a system of belief that a certain number of people identify with. That is to say, Buddhism is, most people who are connected with Buddhism would identify themselves as Buddhists. Taoists, Taoism, most Taoists would identify themselves as Taoists in some way or another. This is not true with shamanism. Shamanism is a scholarly construct. Most people that we would call shamans would not call themselves shamans or even be familiar with the word. Because, as I say, it's an academic construct. Where did it come from? Well, it came from Russian anthropologists in the 19th century. The Russian Empire still is huge, and they conducted ethnographic investigations of the various peoples that they ruled. And one of these peoples were the Tungus tribe in Siberia, southern Siberia, I believe. And one of the anthropologists realized that the name that they called their, shall we say, medicine men, the common term in North America, was shaman. That was their word for it. Some people have attempted to connect it with the Buddhist term shramana, which means hearer, which is the, shall we say, the lowest level Buddhist believers. That is, people who are listening to the Dharma, not necessarily practicing it. Is that right, John? More or less. Good. Close enough for now. Okay. But that's debatable. And what I'm going to call shamanism and what has been called shamanism really doesn't have anything to do with Buddhism. So once this shamanic practice was identified among the Tungus, this Russian ethnographer wrote it up, and at the same time, lots of people were writing up lots of studies of lots of different tribes everywhere. And I mean everywhere, all over the world. And eventually it was noticed that these traditions, practices, beliefs had a remarkable amount in common. In fact, a lot of these are universal, which is astonishing and poses an unanswered question, which is, how did this universal religion come about? Because it came about in prehistory. There was no Buddha who preached shamanism. There was no Christ, no Muhammad who preached shamanism. This was just done all along into time immemorial. So how did this spread? Well, with all these things, there are two explanations. One is diffusionist, which means that it started somewhere, say when human beings were all living in the same place, presumably in Africa, and as the human race spread, they kept this religion with them. The other is what could be called archetypal, which is to say, this comes out of C.G. Jung's psychology, the idea being that, well, the human mind is constructed in certain ways that are universal, and therefore people are going to come up with these answers independently no matter where they are. There's no really easy way to sort through the two, but I think there's probably some truth to either one. So shamanism is an attribute mostly of primitive tribes. It has been argued that you can't really be a shaman today in the West. Why? Because shaman is a social role as well as a certain set of beliefs and practices. And by this theory, which I don't entirely either agree or disagree with, the shaman represented a social role that was before the specializations of our society. That is to say, the shaman was priest, healer, advisor, diviner, all sorts of things that were later pharmacists, that were later branched off. Now, most people who consider themselves shamans today in the West, and there are a lot of them, don't agree with this and don't like to be told it. As I say, I neither disagree nor agree with it, but it's worth pointing out that the social role of the shaman in primitive tribes bears no resemblance, or only the faintest resemblance, to what someone practicing shamanism in America today could be or do. And there are people who do practice shamanism, and we'll get to that. So, what is shamanism about? Well, one thing to set aside would be our usual concepts of the gods as conceived of by pagan polytheistic faiths. You know, we're basically familiar with paganism through the gods of Greece and Rome. Well, the Greeks had a god for this, the Romans had a god or goddess for the sewer. The Romans built a huge sewer in 500 BC when it was still a tiny village, and actually was very key to Rome's greatness. But there was Venus Cloacina, for cloaca means sewer in Latin. They had a god for excrement, who is Sterculius, who's later identified with Apollo. So the Romans had a god for this. Well, all of this that I just said is very, very late. And in paganism and in shamanism, they didn't really see things that way. They saw the world as alive and conscious. Like if you read the Rig Veda, which is the oldest known scripture, the Hindu text, there's a hymn to Varuna, the god of the wind. Well, except he's not really the god of the wind if you read this carefully. He is the wind. There's no god up there doing it. He is the wind. The characteristics of Varuna are the characteristics of the wind, viewed in a personal way. And if you get that, then you understand somewhat about how shamanism works or thinks. Everything is alive. Everything is personal, sort of, except there's no gods on Olympus up there necessarily pulling strings. They are divine beings, but they are the same. They are the storm. They are the wind. They are the earth. They are the sky. They are both the objective sky and earth as we know it, and as living beings that you can relate to. And since they're living beings that you can relate to, they can like you or dislike you. They can be friendly toward you, or they can be mad. So this is one element to bear in mind. I couldn't resist, you know, after the latest hurricane, and I really miss identifying them. I don't remember whose name belongs to which hurricane. They all each seems worse than the other. But I remember after the last one putting up on Facebook, you know, the earth gods are mad. Again, I kind of didn't mean it, but in the other way I kind of did. A long subject in its own right, as you'll know. But you could have relations with all of these things, personal relations. good or bad. They might be friendly, they might be unfriendly, they might mostly, I guess the default position is they're mostly neutral, but you could get on their good side or their bad side. In addition, there are other worlds beyond the natural one, which are also inhabited by spirits. And basically there are three, which kind of correspond to our experience. A lot of shamanism, a lot of this indigenous religion of all sorts is very intuitive, because to some extent it came out of the way things are and the way we experience something. So what do we experience? Well, there's this air stuff above us. There's this earth stuff below us. There's us in the middle of it and various creatures walking on it. And that is how they saw the world. There are many subtle variations in this, but the basic distinction is the one I've already given you. There's this world, which we function in normally. It's hard to say that entirely seriously, but you know what I mean. And the world, the spirit, the world of heaven, and the world below the earth. Now, this was also very widespread. To go back to the Greek gods, the Greeks had two sets of gods. One were the Olympians, who are the gods that you know about and whose statues you see in museums and so on. And then there are the Chthonic deities. Chthon comes from the Greek chthon, meaning earth. And these are the gods who resided under the earth. And each god, at least the major gods, had a counterpart. There was Olympian Zeus, and there was Chthonic Zeus. You don't hear too much about the Chthonic deities for the very good reason that it was generally considered inauspicious to mention them. But they were there. And for example, Chthonic Zeus was at least partly responsible for plants growing, as makes sense because they're coming out of the earth, aren't they? So they existed and they revered them, but they don't talk about them too much. They're much more, well, dicey to handle than the Olympian gods were, which is why all the myths are, practically all the Greek myths are about the Olympian gods. Now, there are these three realms, and we tend to conceive of kind of the spiritual cosmos in a way that's left over from Christianity. Some of us are still Christians, but even many people who aren't still see things this way. And it was not unlike what I just described to you, but whatever is below the earth was literally infernal. Infernal means below. And it came to mean more or less, this came to be more or less synonymous with hellish, hell. So it's a place of evil. You definitely don't want to go there. You know, Dante's Inferno, it says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." This is not true in the shamanic vision. The spirits and powers of the earth are again, neither positive nor harmful in and of themselves. They can relate to you if you speak to them nicely, if you address them nicely. And you can, as I say, you can learn things from them. They can tell you certain things, like maybe what herb is good for what ailment. the common view today of traditional primitive medicine is that it was just a long, long result of trial and error over thousands of years. That is to say, they tried this, they found it didn't work. Maybe. But that's not how traditional peoples often view their pharmacology. The spirits appear and can be contacted and can tell you which is good for what. Sometimes generally, the way you go to the doctor and he writes you a prescription for some thing you have that's general enough for him to identify, and what he'll write you will supposedly help. Or in this particular case. And then there are beings of the earth, all of which are spirits also. The animals are, a lot of times they're viewed as having a kind of collective spirit. That is to say, it actually, for some strange reason, resembles a theory of Plato in a weird way. You could have a relationship not just with a particular bear, but with bear as an archetype, as the bear as an animal. And this also explains a lot about traditional religions and taboos. Because if you are of the bear tribe, you regard the bears as kin. And therefore, you have lots of taboos. God forbid you should kill one. If you're from another kind of clan whose totem animal is quite different, from your point of view, it might be perfectly fine to kill bears, but you have your own animal that you shouldn't kill. And this explains a lot. And it explains totem poles, because the totem poles, which we know from the Pacific Northwest chiefly, are representatives of these spirits. And you could have more than one, which is why there are different faces on these poles. Sometimes they're quite tall. So that was one way that you were connected with the natural world. Now, in some tribes and traditions, it was kind of something you were born with. That is to say, you were born to the bear tribe, so you're a bear. Other times, it's a matter of like an inner journey, which is a matter that we'll get to. Similarly, there is the world above. And again, as a result of Christianity, everything kind of above is thought of as good, everything down here is thought of as bad. Well, that too has to be set aside when you're thinking about shamanism. Again, these are powers, beings that can relate to us, and they can be on our side. If we've offended them somehow, we have to make it right. And you see this again in Greek paganism. What are the heroic epics about? One of the gods got mad. The whole Iliad started because Apollo got mad at the Greeks. The whole Odyssey is because Poseidon got mad at Odysseus and kept driving his ship around for years and years. Again, that's a fairly late form, but you can offend the gods. That's why I made that joke that the earth gods are mad, because I don't think anybody's going around in any large scale attempting to propitiate the earth gods, at least not in the advanced West as we like to think of ourselves. So these are the three realms. They can be subdivided and have been subdivided. And the person, can you visit these realms and interact with these beings in a way that's kind of beyond the usual? Yes, you can. I would suspect that many traditional peoples have had some experience what they would consider a spirit they encountered, very likely in the form of a particular animal. And they might find that this particular animal, not only like an individual bear, but like bears seem to be around them a lot. They see a lot of bears. Bears aren't really very threatening. They see a lot more bears, and so they have some kind of relationship with them. But the shaman is a unique figure. The shaman is trained to travel into these worlds psychically and encounter spirits and get what he needs to get. Sometimes this is guidance from the spirits about what to do with so-and-so, or what so-and-so should do to lift the bad luck that he's experiencing, or cure his disease, or whatever. Sometimes, and this is a really rather unique part of shamanism that is, again, universal, the shaman may practice soul retrieval. Now, again, in the West, if we think of a soul, we think of it as a unitary thing, even though no one seems really quite to know what a soul is, or whether they have one or not, or what it would be like either to have or not have one. But that is another lecture. But in these cultures, the soul is not a unitary thing. It's not a single thing. It can be fragmented. It can be broken. Parts of the soul can be broken off as a result of trauma of some, usually as a result of trauma of some sort or another. Not necessarily physical trauma, also emotional trauma. And what does the shaman do? Well, the shaman may deem it necessary to journey, and then I'll talk about this in a little while, into these other realms and find the missing soul piece. There's a book coming out called, in the near future, called Curanderismo, Soul Retrieval. Now, Curanderismo is a traditional Latin American folk way, which incorporates a lot of shamanism. And this book happens to be about how you do it in the world of Curanderismo. I would guess that many of its features are common to a lot of different tribes, a lot of different nations, a lot of different regions. So if you are suffering from some psychological ailment, which people do all the time in all cultures, it may be necessary for the shaman to go and retrieve this soul, this part of the soul. By the way, in certain shamanic traditions, I know there's one in Russia, I forget the name of the tribe, the soul kind of dissipates when you die. That different parts of the soul go to different places. One part of the soul just kind of dies, another goes here, another goes there. So that's another way in which the soul is not necessarily unitary. But here, what I'm talking about is the result of trauma and how it is fixed. And through occult means, the shaman goes and finds this part, and I don't know, he or she may not be successful the first time. He may have to go back and bring it back through and incorporate it back into the patient by certain ritual means. And then that trauma, according to the theory, is healed. I myself think there is a lot to this, because I did a little of this kind of shamanic work a long, long time ago, and I had people do it for me. These people didn't know anything about me. I mean, other than we're all in the same circle and they knew my name. But, you know, they came back and, you know, oh yeah, here's this missing piece that's back there. And I could certainly relate to what they were saying. It was immediately obvious to me what they were talking about, even if the details were not quite as precise as my memory. So I'm inclined to believe this sort of thing happens or can be done. This might be interesting in today because there's an enormous amount of post-traumatic stress disorder, as the name for it currently goes. And it's a lot more widespread than anybody wanted to believe a generation ago. That is to say, what? Childhood abuse certainly is going to cause it. There's a general belief, I don't know how true it is, but if you had some actual combat experience in the military, you may well be suffering from this. Or let's put it this way, people who have fought in the military in combat situations probably have it to a much higher level than the ordinary, you know, the collection of the rest of us ordinary slobs, if I may be so rude. So it might actually, and I'm sure there are people, I know there are people who do work this way with people in this particular condition, whether or not it's a result of combat or not. So how do you get to be a shaman? Sometimes there are family traditions that your father or mother or grandmother was a shaman. Sometimes in some tribes, you may not be able to be taught by your father or mother. You have to be taught by your grandmother or grandfather. Sometimes it's kind of a gender thing. If you're a boy, you may need to be taught by your grandmother. If you're a girl, you maybe need to be taught by your grandfather. So there are family traditions, and if there are, they can pass down a lot of knowledge this way. A lot of knowledge about herbs, for example. A lot of knowledge about plants. Because if you learn to be a shaman in this way, you know, as soon as you're able to wipe yourself, you know, they're going to have you pounding herbs for medicines for clients, because it's, you know, it's not like America where children are expected to be indolent until the age of 16, when they're supposed to get a job at McDonald's. That is one way, but it is not the only way. Another way is that you were called by the spirits to be a shaman. And a lot of times, the way you know you've been called is if you have some kind of psychological or possibly physical disorder of your own. And if things develop a certain way, and the usual help doesn't work, you may have to go through what is called a shamanic initiation. And this is, in many cultures, many times, many cases, done not by the individual, not by humans, but by the spirits. And the processes are, again, there are a lot of descriptions of these in anthropological literature, and you know, the ones in Australia sound like the ones in South America that sound like the ones in Africa. So you do have to wonder what's going on here. But a lot of times, one aspect of this, a key aspect of it, is kind of a ritual, not only death, not necessarily ritual, but this is something you experience not only as death, but dismemberment. That is to say, you feel, as a result of the spirit initiation, as if your body's being torn apart. I think you can fairly well conclude from that that this is not generally experienced as pleasant. In fact, it's a harrowing, it is an initiation, on quite a different level than any initiation you might go if you join an occult lodge today, or if you join the Masons or something of the sort. The initiation you get will be nothing like this. It's very intense, but then the spirits put you back together in a different way. Outwardly, do you seem different? Well, I don't know. But you feel different, and you have a different relationship with the spirits, and you're able to communicate with them in a way that most people can't most of the time. Now, how do you do that? Well, again, there are many methods, but one very common one is what's called trance journeying. That is, you get into a particular state of consciousness, an altered state of consciousness, and in this altered state of consciousness, you subjectively go to these other realms and find out what you need to find. How are these altered states achieved? Well, the two most common ways, in certain tribes and certain cultures, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, psychoactive plants may be used, like peyote or ayahuasca. Now, or psilocybin mushrooms. Now, the curious thing about the Western Hemisphere is, again, for who knows what reason, it has many more psychedelic plants than the Eastern Hemisphere. That is to say, North and South America have a lot more of these indigenous, that are here than Europe and Asia and Africa for whatever reason. So that stuff is more common here than it is in other cultures.
Can you say that again?
Excuse me?
What's more common here?
The number of psychedelic plants. There's different species of psychedelic plants. There are a lot more of them in North and South America than there are in Europe, Asia, and Africa.
And what do these psychedelic plants do? They cure?
Kind of, but here's the thing. The idea is that they obviously alter your consciousness, so you can go to these other realms more easily. And in kind of the North American, kind of southern US, northern Mexico area, peyote, which is a type of cactus and has little buttons. I guess they're this. I've never actually seen one or much less taken one, but I think they're about that size. We'll do that for you. In the Andes, or the South American jungle, there's a drink called ayahuasca. And this is made of two different plants and made in kind of a potion. And you drink that and you see visions. It tastes like a bitter prune puree. Like if you mashed up a bunch of prunes in a blender and took all the sugar out somehow, it would taste like that. I think you can safely conclude from this that it doesn't taste too good. And both of these things, curious enough, are emetic. That is to say, you are very, very likely, particularly if you take them, the first couple of times, to throw them back up again. I did take ayahuasca once. This was 1991. And it was kind of weird. You had to, they gave you an elaborate fast dietary regimen that you had to follow for 10 days. No alcohol, no caffeine, no meat, no sugar, no spices, no herbs, no citrus. There was a lot you couldn't do. So I was, committed enough to do it, to follow this diet, not to mention pay whatever fees I had to pay. So we got together and we got this bitter prune puree. And it was really rather, I suppose you could imagine, it was a really rather weird experience because the minute I swallowed this, my body wanted to throw it up. But I think, I don't know. I guess I should hold it down at least a little. I mean, I paid all this money. I did this, this 10-day fast for it. I guess I should try to, and I did manage to hold it down for 15 minutes or a half hour, and then they gave you little plastic buckets for this purpose, which was provident of them. My own experience was not particularly good or particularly profound. In fact, it kind of, I suppose it gave me a new relationship with my body. And I sort of cured my body saying, look, I've actually been pretty good to you. I've been pretty healthy and I've kind of, really done everything you want me to do. Don't you ever, ever, ever do this to me again. So, from which I conclude that ayahuasca is not for me. This was in California. If you had experience in the jungle in South America, of course, it would be quite different. Not necessarily better or easier. And one of the problems is, there are ayahuasca tours you can go on. You can take a trip, kind of like a junket, so to speak, except I don't think it's very luxurious, to areas, and they will give it to you. And you'll take it and you'll have what experience you have. And this has caused some problems because, they really do give you this stuff and it really does work. But then suddenly it's over. After a day, you're flying back to your apartment in Lower Manhattan, and how do you integrate it all? And it can, that in and of itself, just integrating it can cause problems. And the thing about these junkets is that they often don't have anyone who's going to bother to follow up with you after. I've not taken one of these things myself, but this is knowledgeable people have said this to me. So this stuff is, you can do it, but many people have much more profound experiences than I did. And if you have it regularly, oh, by the way, the ayahuasca has a spirit too that kind of appears to you in your vision and also will teach you things. And if you are a long-term practitioner of this, you get, more adept at it, and you get more and more of a relationship with this ayahuasca spirit. The same is true of the peyote spirit. In fact, I have an artwork done by the Huichol Indians of Mexico depicting the peyote spirit. And sometimes if you've had a few and you stare at him for a while, he'll do a really rather interesting dance for you. So it's kind of animated, but it isn't. So that's one way of journeying. The other way, which is even more common, because of course, as I say, psychedelic plants are not available in every vicinity, is drumming or some kind of musical procedure. It has been shown by science, I guess, that a certain kind of rhythmic pounding will, if you do it long enough, and will send you, in the absence of other stimuli, will send you into an altered state. And that is much more common and more universal because why? Well, you can make a drum anywhere, but as I say, these plants are not necessarily available. In Siberia, they do use the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which is a red mushroom with white spots on it. Sometimes you see them in, like little tchotchke stores, like this cute little cookie jar is in the form of an Amanita mushroom. But one problem with the Amanita muscaria mushroom is I have been told by knowledgeable sources that the line between a psychoactive dose and a fatal dose is a rather thin one. Oh, and by the way, not every mushroom has the same amount of active ingredient, so it's always kind of a bit of a guesswork. Which is why that even in our drug-crazed culture, not too many people use the Amanita muscaria. So you are journeying up to see these spirits. And the worldview is important is kind of the world axis. The axis mundi, sometimes it's called the axis of the world, which is not the axis around which planet Earth turns. It is kind of the center of all of the worlds we've been talking about. And it works like an elevator, or can work as an elevator under certain circumstances. That is, you say, you go to this realm, this center, and that means you can travel up or down. How does this symbolize? Well, in the North American Indian tradition, there's one major symbol for this, which is the pipe. As you probably know, in many Indian tribes, the pipe is an extremely sacred object. And if you are a pipe carrier, it's not everybody gets to be a pipe carrier, and if you do, it's an honor, but it also an honor that comes with a lot of responsibilities. Someone sent me an email. As you know, I'm editor of Quest, and offering an article about some native grandmothers in the whole Standing Rock business, where they were not only mistreated, but their pipes were treated with disrespect, which is a great crime in those cultures. The guy's going to write the article. He hasn't written it yet, so I can't tell you any more. But the pipe is a symbol that, oh, by the way, the smoke rises, and that's kind of another, not only symbol, but kind of stimulus for it. Tobacco is an interesting thing. It is the primary kind of sacred substance of the American Indians. And I suppose if you were going to call the primary sacred beverage of the West would be wine, that is alcohol. And so it was very curious to see that, the Indian culture and the white culture, each destroying itself with the other's sacred drug. You ever think about that? That is weird. Explanations not to come. Apparently wild tobacco is something real different from even pipe tobacco you buy in a store, even Native American, American Spirit cigarettes. Apparently it's really, really intense, and I gather somewhat difficult to smoke. They don't use tobacco in the pipe itself. I'm also told they use a substance called kinnick. I don't know what's in it, but they use it, and I wouldn't be surprised if it had tobacco in it. I don't think it's psychoactive in anything more than a very mild way, but So anyway, all of that is connected with the symbol of the axis of the world. So this is a shamanic vision. It is universal. It's spread everywhere without anybody preaching. Of course, over the last 200 years, as the missionaries came, of course, it was something that they always tried to eradicate as superstition. Sometimes not always in a nice way. But people are kind of coming to these sort of, that, there actually may be something more to this than Western mainstream culture would like to suspect. So there is a lot of shamanic practice. Well, how do you do this? Well, there was an anthropologist named Michael Harner who studied this phenomenon among the Jivaro Indians of Brazil and practiced it among them. But he was also an anthropologist, and he read all this literature that we've just, I've mentioned. And he came up with a thing that he called core shamanism. And it is, in his view, kind of the distillation of all of this. And unlike traditional shamanism, in which the spirits have to rip you apart and put you back together, you can do it in workshops. I mean, a lot of people make fun of, wow, you can be a shaman. Having done some of that, and I haven't done it for a long time, I will say that there's value and power in it. It's safe because it's done with drumming, of course, not with psychedelics. And there are lots of, the Foundation for Shamanic Studies teaches a lot of workshops. And I don't think Michael Harner teaches anymore because I imagine if he's still alive, he's very old. But the Foundation for Shamanic Studies, you can look up their website. And my experience with them, which now again goes back over 25 years, was good. And so was my experience with the drumming circle that I was part of that came out of it. And the idea was in this particular circle that you take a journey of this sort, either to the upper world or the lower world, depending. You never journey for yourself. You always journey for someone else. Why? Well, A, it's a nice thing to do. B, you're in no way ever going to be able to disentangle yourself from your own situation enough to view it with any objectivity. Your fears, your anxieties, your problems, your blocks, the very things you have to deal with are the very things that are going to keep you from seeing what you have to see. So you always journey for someone else. And sometimes it is soul retrieval, sometimes it's for guidance. Now, there are many other ways of doing this. And there are many people who've really gone through an enormous amount of trouble to go and study with indigenous teachers in their own context, in their own tribes. This requires a lot of work, time, trouble, and expense. So if someone does it and they do it at all seriously, they're pretty serious. They're pretty dedicated. One person who might talk to about this is Chris Pateros, who is she's not local anymore, but she does do things here. I think isn't she having a workshop in a couple of weeks? Well, I'm very fond of her. I've done a couple of rituals that she's done, and I thought they were very good, so that might be one thing to look at. So it is possible, and you may, for example, take a journey and to discover your power animal. That is to say, what animal do you have an affinity with? Oh, by the way, generally speaking, well, in circles they do this, but generally speaking, particularly in traditional cultures, you don't tell anyone else what your power animal is, because knowing someone's power animal gives them power over you. And there is a negative side to all of this, right? The shamans, I think very often will say just about any ailment is caused by evil spirits in one way or another. So there are evil spirits. Oh, and you can, if you're not such a nice guy, you can get evil spirits to do something bad to someone else. It's a very curious story. The Hawaiian shamans are called kahunas. And this happened in Hawaii in the early 20s. There was this Irish cab driver in Honolulu who got involved with a native girl. And her grandmother, decided that this Irish cab driver, probably with good reason, was up to no good. And he got sick. He got sick. He got to the point where he had no feeling or movement in his body from the bottom up, and it kept rising. And of course, the doctors had no idea. And someone knowledgeable, I think I know what that is. So they went to the grandmother and said, look, I know you don't do this kind of thing, but if this Irishman were to, shall we say, leave town and never come back here, leave your granddaughter alone, maybe it would be possible to lift the curse. And that evening, the Irishman was better and caught the next boat to San Francisco, wisely. Now, this is an interesting story because, you know, a lot of sort of alleged debunking of this kind of thing is based on these grounds, that it's the power of suggestion. You believe you've been hexed, so of course you start to act as if you've been hexed. This may be true to some extent, but in this case, and cases like this, the Irishman didn't believe in this stuff. The Irishman never heard of this stuff. He had no idea of what was going on. And no one did it, except someone who knew like maybe a little bit about native Hawaiian culture, kind of put two and two together. So it couldn't have been the power of suggestion to him because it wasn't anything he believed in or knew about. Oh, by the way, if you put a curse on someone, I think black magicians all over the world will agree on this point. You don't want them to know you put a curse on them, because then they'll take it off. You never tell a person you put a curse on them. You put the little curse thing under their doormat or something. I'm not giving anybody directions or advice about this sort of thing, but this is kind of the practice. It's not the power of suggestion because they don't know. So that deals with some of the debunking. The Hawaiian kahunas also have what is called the death prayer, and you can pray someone to death. It had the Irishman not taken the hints, it probably would have turned into the death prayer for him. So you can do a lot of things, and a lot of shamanic activity is designed to counteract possibly the things other shamans have done, or other ordinary people who have to know a little bit about this sort of thing do. Oh, well, hey, since we're on the subject, shamans can kind of do this to each other, can't they? So in many shamanic cultures, there's a kind of occult warfare that's taking place. That is to say, one is kind of fighting with the other and whatever. Now, I remember reading somewhere, I think it was in a Castaneda book, and he's another story, Carlos Castaneda, but it may not have been, that there are traditions among the Native Americans that there were great civilizations on this continent that destroyed themselves through malign use of occult magic, just like I've talked about. I'm not saying there is, there was, I'm not saying there wasn't. Carlos Castaneda, by the way, is probably the most famous exponent of this. Whether he used the term shamanism or not, I don't exactly remember. But he was, again, an anthropologist in Southern California, and he went out into the desert and studied with a sorcerer, I guess that's what the term he used, named Don Juan Matus.
I read his books.
Yeah, I mean, they're very, very widely read, and they were extraordinarily, they probably still are, but they were extraordinarily influential in the 70s. He wrote several, and at some point someone decided that a lot of this sounds like fiction. So I asked the one person, I'm sure any number of you have read Castaneda books at some point or another, so this may be of interest to you. I asked the one person, the most knowledgeable person I ever met about this very question. She had been married to the spiritual and temporal chief of the Yaqui Indians. So she was in a position to know something. I'll tell you the two things she told me, and those are the only two things she told me. One is the first book, The Teachings of Don Juan, is pretty genuine. Later on, the later books have a lot more kind of fictional material spun in. And then she said, you know, once I actually lived in a house belonging to Don Juan Matus. So sometimes people try to prove that Castaneda just made up this whole Don Juan character. I don't think so. Particularly in the first book sold so well, he's going to have to write another one, and sometimes your experience is outstripped by the market demand. So but from all of this, I am convinced that the seed of it, and oh, by the way, who first published The Teachings of Don Juan? I actually have a first edition of it. The University of California Press. So it was a scholarly work before it became a popular one. I don't know, I throw that out there because Castaneda's name is certainly more famous than any others I've mentioned so far. All right, so I'm going to stop. So we have some time for questions, so let her rip.
Thank you. I actually have two questions. My first question is, has marijuana been used as a psychedelic agent to explore the spirit realms?
I've never heard of it being used in a shamanic context, but of course it certainly has been used. The sadhus of India use it quite heavily. And sadhus are kind of holy men ascetics who wander around naked, often completely naked, because India is pretty warm, and B, because they've been doing this for thousands of years and everybody is used to it and it's part of the culture. They tend to do it. I've heard it used less in the kind of context that I've been talking about, but people certainly do, and I'm sure people are doing it right this very minute as legalization advances. What was your other question?
Have any women claimed to have, I don't know how you phrased it, having the spirits pull them apart to welcome them into shamanism, or not welcome them, but
yeah, it's
through
the
process of childbirth?
Through the process of childbirth?
Mm-hmm.
Well, women do have rather intense experiences, but I don't think, I've never heard of a case where the shamanic journey took place during childbirth, although they are probably of equal pain levels.
I'm wondering how much of the shamanism would you say is, how much are the psychedelics used as opposed to, say, a drug-free meditation? I tend to draw contrast between a practice of drug-free meditation as being regenerative to the brain, to the physical brain, and then the psychedelics as being sort of damaging, physically damaging to the brain. How does this reflect in shamanism?
No, because a lot of people would agree with you, of course, and the drug-free method has many advantages, including the fact that it's legal, and any drug, particularly artificial psychedelics, they can be good or they could not be. Oh, and by the way, as they kept drumming in to people, and no pun intended, people's heads and the whole Leary thing, set and setting makes a big difference. So, going to a rock concert under the influence of LSD and having it be a kind of a conscious inner journey are two quite different things. Whether they're destructive or regenerative or not, that I don't know. But you know, there are a lot of warnings against the use of psychedelics. It's certainly, you know, the old occult traditions always warned against drug use, but when all these warnings do come from a time before psychedelics were even invented or even known about in this area. So, you know, what they're really talking about is opium and hashish. And opium probably isn't too good to use. I mean, just the sheer addictiveness. Cannabis, well, I'll leave that to you to decide.
So did you say that even if you're not born in a family that's shaman, that you can learn the gifts that shamans have?
Mm-hmm.
And how would one do that?
Well, I've told you the two basic ways. One is to go down to Peru, go down somewhere and study. And, you know, this is hard to do. There are courses, as I say, in you know, shamanic practice, and then you can gather with like-minded people who've gone through the same course and do the same thing in a much more integrated way. You're doing a shamanic journey maybe, you know, once a week in someone's home, and you can fit it into your life. Spending 6 months in Peru, you know, with a native teacher may require some adjustments to your schedule.
And then the other question you said, which was very, another thing that you said, which was very interesting was, and I want you to clarify it, you said that as a shaman, you can't cure your own wounds. You have to do it for other people?
Well, I think so. I mean, what you know, practicing shamans do for themselves in traditional cultures, not something I'm really qualified to say. But, you know, in the Western context that I've been talking about, it's better to have someone else do it because you're just not separate. Oh, by the way, you know, and if you're physically sick, well, it means you're physically sick. It means you don't have the extra energy to do it, right? I mean, that's quite different from the shamanic spiritual dismemberment, which is not a disease in any kind of clinical sense that we know of. This is talking about, you know, I have X, Y, and Z going on. I need to have it cured.
Does a shaman always have to do it in a group setting?
No,
he can do it on his own?
I think in traditional cultures they do it on their own more often. Because the shaman is like the local doctor, priest, you know, so he's the only one around. Whether other people participate in the ritual or not, I don't know, but you know, he really kind of has to do it alone because there's probably no one else qualified. You know, these are Western adaptations to it, and I think they you know, they had their own legitimacy, but you know, they're not going to be identical, and they are fitted to some extent to Western contexts and needs.
So if he's not using psychedelics and he's not using drumming, is he meditating to contact these spirits, or how is he doing it? Do you know?
I don't know. I mean, the literature always says that the most common way is through drumming, right? But I could well imagine contexts where it would involve something like what we would call meditation, or maybe you know, some are good enough so that they can do it without anything at all, you know, once you get some practice. So anyway, that's what I understand of it.
How does our legal system look at the shaman?
Well, as I think you can say with many things involving the North American Indians, it's not a pretty story. For a long time, it was actually against the law to practice native religions. It was forbidden. Yeah, I know there's this First Amendment, but it was still forbidden. And that ban was lifted. I don't know. I mean, the ban against all practice of national approach, I think, was sometime in the early 20th century. There was a famous case in the 60s where a group of natives put together kind of a Native American church in which they used peyote in their ceremonies. And of course, peyote is Schedule I substance. It means they can't even do research on it. So they had a famous landmark court case where they said, hey, well, this is a First Amendment issue because this stuff is involved in the traditional practice of our religion. And they won the case. So, you know, in the Native American church, I suspect that the DEA doesn't have, like, you know, Native American traditional uses of things like peyote very high on its list of concerns. So I haven't had any sense of that. But the rest of shamanism, you know, to the extent that it's a drug issue, there's that. The rest of it, it's really no different from any other religion. Although, you know, there's always the little affair of practicing medicine without a license, and that's kind of ambiguous.
You mentioned that shamanism original shamanism was spread more or less worldwide and was very similar. In what respect was it similar? Philosophically or in the rituals as well? What can you elaborate on the similarities?
Let's say that most of the things I've said in this lecture in the last hour are reasonably universal. So that's what is going on here. I mean, the most famous, if you want to go into the most famous academic study of it is called Shamanism by Mircea Eliade, who is a Romanian scholar who kind of put all this together. He was at the University of Chicago, and he wrote a classic work on it, and he describes it as a worldwide phenomenon. A lot of what I'm saying kind of comes out of his work, which spread very far. And again, a lot of the stuff comes from anthropological field work done by people who, yeah, they probably were aware of similar things in the past, but I think they're very unlikely to base their studies on anything but, in most cases, their own encounters with these people.